troubling passages in the Old Testament to do with warfare, slavery, and so on. Having said that, the point is that all the people who fought for the abolition of slavery were essentially Christians. Well, no, not all of them, but the vast majority of the weight behind the abolitionist movement came from Quakers, evangelicals, Shaftesbury, and so on, at the expense of the British Empire, in terms of it's a very costly thing to end the slave trade. Likewise, in the early church, what you're seeing there is absolutely there are slaves and masters. Paul is writing his letters to households where there are slaves and masters. But the point of the whole thing is that itself was incredibly countercultural, because the church was a place where the slave and the master both came and were, as it says in Galatians, one in Christ. Mm-hmm. Now, did that abolish the social category of slave and master? No, of course it didn't, because that was just the de facto way that the world existed. Slavery, the fact that today we believe slavery is wrong is very peculiar when you look at the history of the world. It's very, very bizarre. And what's happening, I think, in the early church is that they're not expecting to overturn this huge social norm in one go. But what they do is radically undermine it by having the slave and the master on equal terms in that setting. So one of the verses that I'm sure was left in the slave Bible was, slaves, obey your master. Okay. Probably the next verse was taken out, which was, master, treat your slaves well, do not treat them harshly, and so on, because they are your brother in Christ. Okay. So that in itself is absolutely radical in the Greco-Roman world. No one else was saying that. Okay. And when you have a book like Philemon, where Paul has taken in a runaway slave and sent him back to his master and says, I'm sending him back not as your slave, but as your brother in Christ. That is establishing a very, very different trajectory to everything else happening around it. So I just disagree with this idea that, you could read it this way, you could read it that way. The reason the abolition movement was absolutely led by Christians is because they read the Bible, in my view, the right way. And it's not a kind of, well, it says this and it says that. Obviously, there are parts of the Bible where slavery is part of is kind of being at one level recognized and kind of codified in the Old Testament. But to simply point to those verses and say, there you see, God approves of slavery, is to basically treat the Bible like a fundamentalist and say we just read off ethics and morality by reading verses sort of solo in the Bible. The Bible is a story of God's revelation over time, and it's basically what we get in the end. The fact that you find those verses morally repugnant is because I'm going to do the Tom Holland thing, is because you are the inheritant of a Christian tradition, which you absolutely read the Bible as a Christian.
We might need that other microphone.
So for me, it's about stepping back and saying, look, forget about like the intricacies of the Old Testament. How did we get to this point? And it's absolutely because something happened through the Bible, through Jesus, through the early church that led us to the view that you can't buy and sell people.
I do want to move on, but can we give you a 1-minute rebuttal if you would like?
I'll try my best. There are so many things to say. Yes, it still does depend where you look, I'm afraid. You'll know as well as I do that in 1 Peter, we read the words, slaves, be good to your masters, not only to the kind, but also to the cruel. Right? And so if somewhere else it says, slaves be good to your masters and masters be good to your slaves, again, what we're dealing with is a text that contradicts itself. So much to say. Secondly, like the whole sort of, well, this is actually a Christian movement. I wonder why it took some, like over 1,000 years for people to work this out at a time that just so happened to coincide with the Enlightenment. That's when people realized that this is what the Bible was getting at all along. I don't know about that. It doesn't seem that way to me.
Well, that's a historically naive way of looking at it, because slavery essentially was a thing of the past by medieval times, and the impetus was there from the very beginning of the early church. So things do develop slowly. There's no doubt about that. But
I'll tell you what you can do. You can say, so the first thing to really emphasize is that The kind of slavery described in the New Testament, I believe, is totally different, both from antebellum slavery of the American South, which is what people tend to think about when they think about slavery, but also the slavery of the Old Testament. I mean, the Old Testament, people always euphemize it in this way, I think. They say, yes, the Old Testament may contain some descriptions and stuff about slavery. No, it sort of explicitly legislates on exactly what you are and are not allowed to do. And like, I don't have time to go over the verses. I've sort of been talking about them ad nauseum. You'll be aware of them as much as I will. I can do it if you like, but I think most people know that this is the case. The kind of slavery that's probably being described by Paul, for example, or in Peter, or indeed by Jesus, who himself at one point implicitly condones the institution of slavery. But again, we're talking about a totally different kind of slavery. It is like, okay, sure, I can see why that would be the case. It's not a huge problem. What you can do is you can say that slavery starts to get really, really ugly with the transatlantic slave trade. So it's not just be sort of, indentured servitudes who are still treated pretty badly. They have their ears pierced if they want to remain a slave for life, if they want to remain with your wife and kids, that kind of stuff. But it's nowhere near the experience of a slave in the American South. That gets really bad, and people begin to grow uncomfortable. I don't know if it would have to be a uniquely Christian thing that would start to grow uncomfortable by that. But if that's the case, what the Christian can do is they can say, this isn't the way to treat your slaves. What you can't do is say that anything in the Old or the New Testament explicitly or should give us the belief, or even imply the belief, that in principle the ownership of other human beings as private property is wrong. That's not to say that people can't own other human beings as private property in a way that's much more morally justifiable than something like the American slave trade. But people today don't just want to say, well, that kind of slavery was really wrong, but I recognize that its necessity as necessary to a social hierarchy. They want to say it's wrong in principle to own other human beings. If you want to do that, you do not have a biblical basis for it. And in fact, you have a biblical basis for believing the exact opposite.